Hi, I am here on The Conversation, which is my blog supported by Planet Us Enterprises, where we talk about um the different stuff. Lots of things that are lots of ideas and things that can kind of integrate, cross-pollinate, bring in, things together that might not have ordinarily been talked about together because I like that fresh perspective. And I am thrilled to have here with me today Jean-Paul Garnier, who is like a favorite human, maybe alien. Are you alien? Don't answer. Favorite human of mine. Jean-Paul lives and writes in Joshua Tree, California, where he is the owner of Space Cowboy Books. It's a science fiction bookstore, independent publisher, and also the producer of Simultaneous Times podcast, 2023 Laureate Award winner. He is the current editor of Starline magazine and the deputy editor-in-chief of the soon-to-be launched Worlds of IF. He is the author of many books of fiction and poetry, and we're going to talk about some of his books. We're going to shout out Starline, another book of his we'll get to in a second. But yeah, so JP, I met you when I was on one of my gonzo following the impulse trips out to California, where I was like literally like, I don't know, I just got to go. Left New York, got my truck, was like, kept going to LA, started to turn around. And then ironically, I was like, nah, I have to go to Joshua Tree. I just like, there's something about it that I have to just stop there because at the time I was following that impulse to go west. I didn't really know what I was looking for. And then you can't go further west than, LA. So it's like, well, shit, turn around. And I stopped in Joshua Tree and I had rented a cottage or a little casita in town. This was a couple of years ago. And I remember my first night hearing electronica music. So, like a fly to shit. I was like, what is that? What is that sound? And I followed it. And I followed it right to literally your doorstep where Space Cowboy Books was. And the stage was out. I am pretty sure it was Fog Machine playing or doing some kind of like electronic dabble, right? And I just had this lightning bolt of confirmation. Like, this is what I was looking for. This is where I was being called to. And I wound up staying. I actually did this banger. I took a flight back to New York, grabbed a whole bunch more stuff, and then flew back to Joshua Tree and then stayed for a couple of months because the high desert and the creative community in and around Joshua Tree, Yucca Valley, 29 Palms is incredible. And I feel that your part in it is like you're the central node and like the axes just kind of spread out around you. At the time you were doing a lot of performance. I remember quite a few plays were going down at the stage behind your store. And yeah, I wanted to see if you would tell us a little bit about your journey, how you got to the high desert, because that's not home for you. You're a transplant, but now it's home. And how you started, did you even intend to create this like, you know, galaxy of like all this incredible, incredible creative energy?
Um, so no, I didn't intend it. But like the rest of my life, I look around, I see talented people. I'm like, this is easy. Let's make a flyer. Put those people on stage, and they're easy to identify. Like, I remember the first time I talked to you in the bookstore. I'm like, oh, she got a freak flag flying. Like, bring her in. You can tell
Oh
usually, right?
my God.
Um, and so I'd always been a reader, a book person, and I had sort of toyed around with the idea of opening up a bookshop when I lived in different areas. It was always kind of cost prohibitive. I didn't really know what I was doing other than I love books. Um, And then when we got here about it's like 9, 10 years ago, um, Zara, my partner, met this gal who had a little shop, said, "Oh, these sheds are for rent." Um, and Zara came back and said, "Hey, why don't you rent that shed? Open that bookstore you've been talking about." And I was real dubious at first, like, oh, is it something I can pull off? It's just this funky little shed. Um, and I decided, well, I got enough money to throw down for a couple months, see what happens. Um, got it together really quickly. When we first opened, it was in this little shed that, I don't know, maybe 150 square feet. People walk in and laugh, like, what is this? Are you kidding? And I'm like, no, I'm serious. If you know me, I'm serious about everything, no matter how goofy I am. Um,
Yeah,
and then within about a
1000%.
I was still working as a handyman, but within about a year, the bigger location on the same property, like a proper storefront, opened up. And I said, I'm going to pull the trigger. Again, I got enough money for 3 months. I'm going to quit my job, do this thing full time, see if I can pull it off. And never went back. That was 7 years ago. The shop's been open for 8 years now, as of this month. Um, so it sort of just like fell into it and fell more and more in love with what I was doing. And a big part of the, wanting to do books, literature, science fiction primarily, is, I'd worked in food, construction, all kinds of things, hospitality I was in for a long time. When you work in hospitality or food, you're dealing with everybody. And, uh, you know, as much as I wish it wasn't like this, you just can't get along with everybody. you know as much as you try, you're not going to like everybody. Hungry people can be challenging. But book people is book people. If you come into a bookstore, I already know we got something in common. We're off to a good start. And I thought that if I arranged my life that way, my work life that way, that I'd probably enjoy my work a lot more. Turns out it's true. I met so many cool people, yourself included, because of it, because we share this love of something that's done privately. Reading is a private affair,
Mm.
but it's a very intimate thing because of that. And I find that in a bookshop, people speak freely because they want to share that intimate thing that they usually do alone. And so, because it's a place that's totally anti-censorship, on top of that, people come in and they talk real talk, and like that's awesome because you don't get that in a lot of areas in life. And I don't have much of a filter. So it's nice to be in a place where I can roll that way and other people do the same. Um, but past that, it's like it's easy, it's usually pretty easy to tell someone's got cool ideas when they start talking about them. Um, as far as working with people, I kind of have one rule where it's like, if I see nothing but positive coming out of this person, like it's on. Let's do it. If I see negative coming off somebody, it's like, well, maybe it's just a right now thing. So I'm not going to judge. But if it's consistently negative, then like, nah, I don't want nothing to do with that. Um, but if it's positive and you're being honest, like, let's do this. That's what the stage is for.
I'm gonna I'm gonna go back and listen to this, and I'm gonna write that quote down, and then I'm gonna put it on like a plaque in my place in the Planet Does headquarters because I love that. Stay with that, and just knowing it might be, consequential, there might be stuff going on, but like stay with the person who's doing the positive thing. And I definitely felt that from you because I remember pulling up, it was probably like 5 years ago. I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, a while. And at the time, it was before my graduate work, before like a lot sort of started to congeal in my own career, in my own writing, in my own ideas. And I had previously always just wanted someone to listen to me. And like, yeah, I know it's really hard to like sometimes understand what the fuck I'm talking about or like keep up with me, but like I will never shut down the gift of my feral mind where I'm like always pulling so many ideas into different containers. It's just like if people can't keep up, it's not me, it's them. But it takes a certain person to appreciate that and to listen. And I just remember going in there. I don't even think I was doing that much creative writing at the time because it was one of the gifts of being in the desert and why I stayed there. I was like like I was sprung, you know, like I had this like lightning bolt of creative energy just emerge, and I started doing creative writing that honestly like was something that I enjoyed, but I had stopped in my like teens because of negative feedback, and just because there was also not a lot of space to do shit that wasn't mainstream and that other people could understand, or like if other people didn't understand it, if I couldn't publish it, if people weren't like pouring on the praise, then it was like, well, what are you doing all this weird stuff for? So in my interest in parapsychology, transpersonal psychology, and basically the want to make portals through space and time. Yeah, I'm serious too. Like I just wanted to do different things, and you were always interested in listening to my ideas, and that's when I went, oh shoot, like this is like okay, like this is really helpful. And then it started the creative juices flowing, and then and there was just like this momentum. I mean, it was less about what struck me the most out of all of that was the process that emerged basically, because it wasn't like, I think it was like maybe still like another 2 years later, and before I let you read the activator, because that story had been written a long time ago. The insertion of like the desert landscape happened in Joshua Tree, but it was a story that I had written a long time ago. And I was just always like, this is just too weird, because everybody who's read it has just been like, what the hell is this? And then you read it and were like, I want to publish it. Can I put this on the podcast? And I was like, what? See? But it was really just about being in this process of like, holy crap, like this dude is interested in the creative impulse, full stop. And I knew you a long time before I actually got to meet your partner Zara or get to know her, you know. And but she's the same way, in which like it's just like you have to just you keep creating, keep flowing, keep doing, right? And this was in such stark contrast to what I had been previously living in, which was the New York City publishing arena. Like I started at an agency, I was in trade publishing, I was reading, I was doing like some developmental editing and whatever. Um, but hands down, like the going theme or the going vibe was like, if we can't publish this, it's not worth anything. And I had so many people tell me, like, oh, if you just would apply yourself and your skills, you have so much potential. And it wasn't until I lived in the desert and was within your community that I realized, fuck, man, I'm not trying to do what they're doing. Like, I'm doing my own thing. And so, like, yeah, I am applying myself. So this is my potential. And learning creative agency by being in your community was like, I mean, you just can't buy shit like that. It was such a gift.
I think the
Such a gift.
publishing world forgets that, language is this living creature, that you don't control. It does its thing. It's always going to morph. And so, to be told, oh, there's this one way to tell story, it's ridiculous. Um, and the thing about, we were talking about listening before the show. If you listen, everybody knows more about something than you do. Whatever that might be, there's always something to learn from everybody if you listen. And if the world wants to stifle people's stories or how they're telling them, then we're not going to learn that. There's not one way of doing things, especially because language is going to change. It's going to move. And one of the things I found so powerful, and it's amazing, I have this experience with customers all the time. Everyone's got their dreams, and usually people
Mm.
got really cool dreams, but they've just been told over and over that it's not going to happen, that it's a crazy idea or whatever. They hear no for one reason or another. I don't think for a hot second that anybody needs my permission, but I have found that when you say, that's a cool idea, you should do that. Yes. People aren't used to hearing that kind of thing. And, when that permission is given from wherever it's coming from, people are like, oh yeah, my idea, it's not a dumb idea. It's not a dumb dream. There's a reason I dream it. It's time to get started on that, no matter how big or small, because I think we often get caught up in, oh, the dream's got to be big. It doesn't. It can be, my attitude is you start with what's right in front of you. If that goes well, take a step further, um, and so just to when people have things to say and they're actually listened to and validated, it's amazing. I've seen people's life transform just by hearing, hey, that's a cool idea, you know, because people get
Yeah.
so used to hearing no that they don't even want to share those ideas anymore. Um, and that's your purpose getting stifled, that's that's how you end up with unhappy people.
I know, and that's the perfect bridge, right? So part of the work that I do is in mental health care. And I say rule number one is you just got to see people, let them talk, let them spill their guts, whatever. Like all they need to do is be validated and be heard. That's number one. But number two is we live in a fucking sick world. So like somebody could come to me and receive guidance and start to feel better and maybe get in touch with their purpose, blah, like all the things that they want to do, except that then you go back out to the sick world. Like you in the hospital, you got your treatment, and then you go back out and like, oh, you're getting sick again because you live in a sick ecosystem. And one of the things that even though like I'm on a different part of my journey or whatever what I'm working on now, I'm in Alabama. I'm no longer in California. I always feel like it's important. I feel like it's important to from time to time come and check in California because it's that community that's so nourishing that almost does like a course correct for me that is sort of healthy. And one of the reasons I had asked you, if you wanted to have this chat with me is because what you have in the desert is so important as, a direct opposite to this like corporate culture that reaches from coast to coast in this country that's way too big. Yeah, I said it. Um as opposed to this mono mainstream culture, you have this like micro culture that isn't motivated by anything except in my opinion by pure joy and affirmation that is so healthy and restorative. So like meanwhile I can go to like any intellectual lecture, I can go to like discussion on mental health care, and like we can talk all we want about like healing people, but then they need places like this or communities like this to sustain their mental health. Because if you go right back to where, you first started to get sick, well, it's not conducive to a happy ending. And that also means you have to actually seek out community, which is what I think I was doing. I didn't know what I was doing. I don't know. I just ride sometimes. But like when I found it, I knew. And so, in a way, there's this buzzword that's been kicking around about having regenerative subcultures. And that's all like intellectual spanky speak, right? For what you're creating, because this subculture, I mean, it's like it's such a rich experience when I go out there. I just bump into people that I've seen, and it feels like, oh, like I haven't seen you in years, but actually it feels like we just had a chat the other day because they're always performing and they're always writing and they're always having some other kind of project, which goes back to something we were also quickly talking about before we started recording about um, publishing. And I think really generally, anytime you have a creative endeavor that you don't put a money value on, like you have to fight for it, right? Like, and I grew up in blue collar culture. I mean, call it whatever you want. I feel like you grew up in similar circumstances where it was just like leisure is a privilege. Time to do stuff that you're not getting paid for is a fucking privilege. Like, and so for me, part of my own rebellion was to be like, fuck it, I'm just gonna sit around and write for a while and just not expect anything of it. But then, you know, that came with a lot of stuff. You're not a writer if you're not published, if you're not making money from it. And then, am I a writer? Where's my community? Well, definitely wasn't. This type of community wasn't for me on the East Coast. Found it on the West Coast. So,
It's interesting. You say a couple things there I'd love to speak to that tie in with what's important about a place like this, the Mojave Desert. Um, One, our culture's got it all wrong on how our measuring sticks are so bad. We talk about success. You mentioned writing is a luxury. It is, to be able to have that time to do that. Now, when it comes to success, the measuring stick I use is how much freedom I have in my life. And for all this talk of freedom in our culture, we never really define what that it means. Um, and it's different for everybody. For me, it's
Yeah.
not having to answer to the man. It's being able to write, it's being able to read what I want to read. It's being able to make those decisions on the daily. The luxury of being able to create, because we don't always have this luxury. You know, we got to sustain ourselves, and culture doesn't make that easy, especially on the artist. Um, but one thing about this place that I think is like sort of an equalizer that helps people with that is in a desert, nature will fucking kill you if you don't listen to it. You know, your fashion choices, nature dictates that. You know, there's a lot of things that people take for granted in urban environments that the desert won't just give you the spanking, it'll kill you, you know?
Yeah.
And you have to listen to nature and work with nature in that way, you know? Um, you don't have a choice. And I think for a lot of people, it helps you recognize that you ain't as big as you think you are. You know, nature is
Yeah.
always going to be more powerful, and I've never been anywhere in the world that's more obvious and apparent and in your face than in the desert. um it makes you realize what a luxury it is to be warm in the winter or cool in the summer, for instance. And you got to base your daily activity around that. You know, you got to base your fashion choices, what you're drinking, all these things. The desert's in charge, you know, and that can be very humbling for a lot of people. I know it was for me in like the best ways. Um, but that also makes you realize where I have freedom and where I don't, you know. So, you know, in the you've got to be a published writer if you're a writer. No, a writer writes, you know. A writer is someone that's compelled to write. I'm a writer, but I'm not writing. Okay, well, maybe you're compelled to, but you got to sit down and do it. It's it's not an identity, it's something, it's an action, you
Mm.
know. And I think our culture has really mixed up these things together. Oh, it's all got to be, what is your avatar, you know, all this identity stuff. And it's like, look, I could say something all day, if I don't act it, it doesn't matter what I said, you know. And writing is an action. um Publishing is a different action, you know. That's when we share our little telepathy machine that we've created on the paper, so you can have my thoughts and I can have yours when we exchange these things, you know. Um and in my experience working with readers for the last 8 years, is nobody just reads one thing and just wants one kind of story. That's a fiction. It's a ridiculous one. That goes back to, oh, you've got to identify with this thing, and it's like, no, everyone's multifaceted and likes all kinds of things. And I think it's ridiculous of the publishing industry to ignore the fact that, you know, I nobody just wants to read that one story over and over again. I mean, the whole beauty of writing and fiction and nonfiction is to experience things that you have not experienced. Um, you know, particularly in science fiction, you know, that's where we get to explore what isn't, what could be. And that's where it's fun, you know. We can experiment on the page, and we can go through those things together, you know.
Right.
In all kinds of voices, you know. I mean, if mainstream fiction and the publishing world just wants one kind of voice, well, who are we talking to? We might as well just have James Patterson and leave it at that, you know. And that's not enough for people. People want to be challenged outside of their comfort zone and have their, you know, people often ask me like, oh, what's a book that changed your life? And I'm like, well, if you want the one that cracked my noodle, you know, check this out. I don't know if it's going to crack your noodle too, but it sure split mine wide open.
Yeah, no. And I love that you say that because it's not just stories, it's also form. When I came across your podcast, that shit blew me away. I'm like, you're producing flash that was so rich and nourishing and like meaningful, you know? And again, coming at this from like the psychology and the self-care angle, like I write a lot to just kind of vent what's in my mind, but in that form in Flash, I found that I was able to explore so much more because it is shorter. And because I was always like, man, I can't do like a full-length novel, although I'm working on High Voltage and that uh finally tipped 200 pages. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it, right? But anyway, this is after years and years and years of working on it. But in Flash, which I guess like the kind of loose definition is 1,000 words or fewer, something very short, or on your podcast, these stories are just a couple of minutes long and they each explore something. There's stories that are just super short, but for me, they're also so experimental because they can do something that can't be sustained over, 5, 6, 700 pages. And I think that's also really fucking freeing. So like starting small, starting maybe with trying a different character, trying a different perceptual ability. I like to funk stuff up and like make it all mind weird and like reader writer interaction, like I can do that in short form and over, but in a longer work, it would completely just not make sense, right? And so there too is that freedom to not also be part of this, like we all talk the same, we all write the same, we all have to do the same thing all the time. And one of the books that blew my shit open was Garbage In, Gospel Out. This is your book. I read this and I was like, what the fuck was that, man? I didn't even know what that was. But then I went back and then I was like, actually, I know what that was. It was almost like, so it's this slipstream or this like sort of stream of consciousness narrative, right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
That you really don't like, you really kind of don't know what's going on, except that it's this dude's like fantasy or like spilling of his subconscious, and it's all about fucking the man and like not feeding the animals. Don't feed the animals. Yeah, it's such a weird story, that Garbage In, Gospel Out, or Do You Like the View, that kind of just goes, it just it's like a subjective narrative, like inner narrative, but that's like spewing out into the world. And like the idea that like you're going to the bureau and like you're writing reports in the bureau, which is almost like in a way controlling information and controlling, someone's reality. And then like this guy is kind of like coming out of it, but you're just, I was reading it, I was like, I don't know what the fuck that was, except that I knew that what it was. I knew exactly what it was. It was that important piece of writing that didn't just kind of like take me away or like let me fall into a story. It really made me think and go, what the what? And there was obviously some impulse for you to write this. And I'm sure glad you did. So I'm going to read the back so there's a little more context, and then I'm going to let you speak because I'm going to go why. So why'd you do this? So the back says the end times are upon us again. Frank Johnson is a falsifier of reports for the Bureau. Management is concerned that Frank is coming too close to the truth for his own good. The battle between experience and vicariousness has begun, and leaving the planet may be the only option for company men and the upper echelons of society. But are the end times real if they've already happened? Like, what? All right. How did this come about?
So there's a couple things. I think it's rooted in a deep distrust of reality. And
Mm.
here's the thing, that might sound loftier than I mean it, but I've never really trusted the consensus reality,
Oh,
Um,
yeah, no, same. Same.
and it's, did a lot of psychedelics when I was younger. That has something to do with it. Helped my distrust, but even before that, it's like, say there's a hit song and everyone's agreeing on the same thing. I just never bought it, because people don't get along that way. And it's like, these things are fabricated by business, basically,
Yeah.
hence Frank, the propagandist who does not know what he's trying to promote, because there isn't really an agenda. It's just kind of like a chicken with its head cut off, our consensus reality. It's always in flux, um so a couple things happened when writing this book. One, I wasn't trying to write a book. It was vignettes, different exercises I'd tasked myself to do, and some of it was written a long time ago, some of it more recently. And I know we've talked about this before, but I read Anna Kavan all of a sudden, someone gives me a copy of Ice. And yeah, there you go. And
Calling you in. I was bringing in your energy. I was like, oh, put that right by the laptop.
that book changed everything for me, right? Because
Oh yeah.
she does this brilliant thing. The book is weird and idiosyncratic, and it's a crazy science fiction book, right? But I'm reading this and I'm going, wow, it's really resonating with me. What's she done here that's resonating with me? And what I ultimately identified was the barrier between the external world and the external world just don't exist in that book. It breaks down completely. The internal world is manifest out in the external world. You can't tell the difference between the two anymore. And I was like, she nailed it. That's it. That's what I got to do. So when I see that, all of a sudden, I'm like, wait a minute. There's all this stuff I wrote. What is it? So I print out all these pieces that I think are unrelated, and I put them all down in front of me on the floor. I don't know. It was maybe twice the length of what Garbage In ended up being. And all of a sudden, I'm seeing a pattern, and I'm going, wait a minute. What if this, rearrange this? This goes here, this goes here. And all of a sudden, there was this skeleton with meat, and I just realized it just needed tendons. And so I wrote little bits of connecting tissue that connected those parts, changed some names. And I was like, wait a minute, there it is. And it's funny how we don't see certain things until like hindsight. Like I only realized recently, I was like, wow, that's like if William Burroughs had written 1984 or something. Because I didn't even see the parallels with 1984 until reading it, years after I'd written it. And I'm going, wait a minute, there's a lot of similarities in there. And I hadn't read that book in a long time. And how does this break apart? And what's interesting, I'm very excited about that book because it was not just fun to put together, but people's responses to it are always super interesting. Most people's initial response is, what the hell? And then they look at it again or they think about it and they realize it's a satire, and that I'm always happy when the humor comes through, because that's like kind of humor's hard to write. But the book has some ludicrous elements to it. I love absurdism. That's like my jam, like let's make this ridiculous. And so the fact that the humor's come through for a lot of people is exciting to me. I mean, the opening scene in the book, and it's interesting to me that people always look at this first paragraph and go, this is crazy, because I wrote that in the shower, and I was thinking about like what's literally what is stuff actually. Okay, we got this hot water and a bar of soap, and I'm gonna eat some fruit and eggs for breakfast or something, and I'm going, what is this stuff really? Well, soap is made out of pig fat and things like that. Eggs and fruit are literally the genitalia and reproductive organs of different entities. And when you start that first, the book opens up with everything as what it really is, without our symbology that we've abstracted it with. And it's funny because when you lift that veil, everyone goes, this is insane. And I'm going, no, that's exactly what that stuff is, actually. What's a shower? Well, it's an artificial tropical storm. What's an egg? Well, it's a reproductive organ. What's your car? You're burning an old forest. What? Oh, this
Yeah,
symbol of the idea, it's money, and it's just what things actually are. And so when you bring in that objective view of that, people are like, wow, this is crazily subjective. And you're like, nah, it's just removed from association of how we use things. This is what those things are. And that's one of those things that ties back into like the distrust of reality. We use language to express reality, but language isn't anything. It's an abstraction. It's a symbol set that can be mangled really easily.
yeah, and I see that again, jumping over to my wheelhouse or my paradigm, and I see that in working with people and encouraging them. I mean, autofiction, it turns out, scares the shit out of people, right? And so I work a lot in autofiction because I'm like, I want to be upfront and center. I want to bring that bluntness and truth and like very uh just a very visceral stream of consciousness in a different way. So in my autofiction, and there's a lot of I, but there's like a very like I'm always looking at the imagery outside because I'm always trying to get it outside because I'm so inside. And when I work with people and I give them permission to look inside, to start with reflection and then create wherever the fuck they want with it, I'm not joking, but I think people think I'm joking when I say, "Oh yeah, let's make a new reality," right? Like you get it, but then someone else is just like, dare I do that? Like what? And so part of, again, from the mental health aspect, it's like you have to be able to rearrange that outside perspective as well as the inside perspective. And writing in that sense is incredibly therapeutic, or you kind of like you turn into Bob the Builder, but like with your mind, and giving yourself permission to do that in itself was going to take, years of sessions with me. Well, I hope not. I hope not. We'll get there sooner than
It's
that,
it's
but like,
it's that level of
like
freedom
people,
isn't comfortable for everybody at first, is what you're
yeah,
saying, I think.
yeah, exactly. And so when I read this and I really identified with Frank because because there is that moment of awakening where you're just like, ah, no, I really got to do something about my situation. And I am, the fifth dentist. I am the asshole in the room who's saying, like, nope, I'm out. Like, this is not my shared reality. There's like a real terror that comes with that experience. And then the freedom that you find afterward, uh, is nourishing. And so that's where being in community, bringing it full circle, being in community with people like you who just invite this open exploration, not just of the creative form, but what I'm also hearing is like the internal and the external. I mean, you and I have had a lot of conversations around this, and I think it's just things that are interesting to us, but to continue to open up community and offer that. Because I mean, you've grown, people will come to your bookstore and be like, oh, this is a cool place. And, then if you ask them why, I'm sure a lot of them would say like this, I found out a lot of writing that I didn't know about here. And like, I can kind of just be free here. And I feel like there's this just like this ethos of just like, hey man, whatever it is. And just like bring it to me, bring it to this community. And also, like, I think take that out into the world. So we were also talking about publishing and why it's difficult to be a publisher. And I mean, look, it's easy as shit to make a book. If you know what you're doing, and even if you don't know what you're doing, you kind of figure it out, you lay out the manuscript, you publish it, yada yada yada. I think what people get really confused about is the industry. Look, 20 years ago, we'd have gone into Walden Books or Borders, Barnes and Noble, whatever was on the end cap, sell a ton of money, would make that author money. You're making money off your volume. Now you publish a book, maybe you print it, maybe you just do an ebook, and then you get that person who's reading your work to reach out to you. So the money isn't actually in the book, it's actually in the business or like whatever it generates around you. Maybe it's like consulting, maybe, it's hiring you to do something else. But like, this is about not having a gatekeeper in the publishing industry, and this is about micro publishing being punk as fuck, being a way to kind of just like put your own stuff out there. Cause ultimately, what's happening is that you're giving other people permission to have these different realities. And like, I specialize and I do a lot of work with people who have different perceptual abilities. Sometimes they come at me from the spiritual point of view, already able to language things, but they just need support in making sense of their world, or other people who have really suppressed a lot of different perceptual abilities. And I'm talking stuff from like experiences of like mind reading, alien encounters, like near death. They're like, I push this down because this isn't part of the mainstream story. Like I can't, have these types of experiences. I'm like, that's all right. Pull up. I got popcorn. It'll come out of you eventually. What's that story there? So yeah, I find it so important, like the work that you're doing, not just as a writer, but also as a community, as a space holder in some of these, granola munching, tree hugging communities
Well,
would say.
I think
It's
one
all
of the
love. It's all love.
right one of the things that's super important is like the narratives you're talking about, people self stifling themselves in telling these things because, oh, we're not going to be accepted. Books can give us these kind of stories where You know, when you read a book like Ice, Anna Kavan's Ice, the level of freedom that she's shown in her writing, that didn't just teach me about how to write with freedom and kill the censor. Um, but that you can live like that too, you know, and that's where like books can be so important. And I mean, one of the reasons I gravitate towards science fiction in particular, but like any writing could do this, it's the one place you could literally break the laws of physics, yo. You
I
know,
know, it's great.
there is so much freedom that like physical reality isn't even in your way, you know. Yeah, you got to make it sound plausible and believable for the reader to accept, you know, sure. But I mean, and I can't think of any other art form that really does this, you know. I can invent new colors. um you can't do that with paint, you know. The color spectrum's what it is, but on the page you can break those things wide open, you know. And
Yeah.
that level of freedom is empowering to anybody, you know, whether you want to write or not, just to recognize that, you know, your mind is that vast and capable of that. And
Yeah.
because words and writing, it's a symbol set and abstraction, you know, it's kind of like math in that way. You're not locked down to certain things that we are locked down to in this physical reality, you know. You can you can bust that all up. Um and
Right?
you
As
know,
long as
that's
it's within that world. It's almost like an invitation is what I'm hearing, like an invitation to show me your world. So cool. You're making up different colors and cool. Like your creatures are like four-armed like weirdos that live on a gas planet. Okay. Like bring me into that world that you're seeing. What, we're not even we ain't even got to get that deep as to ask about it other than we just want to be in it. Part escapism, part cool, part like shit, this is what interests you? Okay. But I wanted to address that too, because that was on my list of or something that you said within that is on my list of wanting to talk about. Just before this, I was reading the essay that Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove had written. And he is a parapsychologist who is investigating consciousness. Okay, cool, whatever. And he won this like prize that was like it came with a hefty prize um around consciousness. And his winning essay kind of takes different angles to looking at the survival of consciousness after bodily death, right? So all that's saying to me is that it's sanctified in a different community that people are essentially saying, or that science is saying, we allow you to have this reality. We allow you to have it because we can create a framework or a model around it. And there is this really interesting thing around stream of consciousness where, like, okay, like laws of physics aside, there is consciousness. It may or may not be in matter. It may or may not be busting through that matter and creating weird ass realities, right? We've had the experience where a couple times we'd be writing something or working on something, and it like you had written in my voice, or I had talked about characters, and you're like, shit, I was just working with a character named that. I remember Jameson coming up, and I'm
yeah,
telling
yeah,
you about Jameson, and you're like, what the fuck? I'm writing about Jameson. And I'm like, I'm writing about this person named Jameson, right? In high voltage. And so I think that, like, in addition to not being afraid that there's more than just this meat suit, right? There is something about this like literal stream of consciousness that just has to flow through us, and we are like the mediators of it. Publishing is a great way to start to get it out there, but publishing is also like a great, sorry, not sorry, cock blocker, right? For telling us that, like, yes, you can express reality like this, you can express consciousness like this, or no, you can't because it doesn't fit into the market. We don't know how to sell it. I'm thinking also of like Philip K. Dick. The exegesis of Philip K. Dick was published posthumously. When I look at that work, this couple hundred of pages of like mind exploding, which is like the unabridged version of Garbage In, Gospel Out, in my opinion, right? When I look at the exegesis of Philip K. Dick, he's having a spiritual emergence and he's having all of these things come out and he doesn't know what to do, but he writes because he's a writer. This non sequitur, like images coming through and like maybe there's a plot line in it. If there's so, I can't follow it. But like he's still allowed to write that. And from what I remember and reading about it, you know, his crew or his circle was just like, we can't publish it because the guy already has schizophrenia and he is erratic and he's writing weird shit. We don't even know how to call this thing. So we're gonna publish it when it's safer for us, rather than to just allow that out in the collective body of thought.
People
Does
get
that make
really
sense?
yeah, people get really uncomfortable when the reality is broken. But, you know, when I talked about the distrust of reality earlier, it's like, you know, we're sensory creatures in the material world, right? And we've got finite senses, and it's like we're looking at the universe through a pinhole, a straw, you know. We can't accept it all. I mean, one thing I always go back to is like, look, on this planet there's creatures that see UV, there's creatures that see infrared, there's creatures that sense magnetic fields. You know, there are senses that are related to our senses that we don't even have, you know. So we're seeing a small sliver, you know. I mean, imagine if your eyeball was as big as the sun, you could see parts of the spectrum, you know, that we can't see with this little thing that's so limited, you know. I mean, it's barely a sliver, right? um so we have this built up consensus reality that's based off of being blindfolded, essentially. um there's so much more to it, and we're really uncomfortable getting out of that little sliver that we're used to having, you know, with PKD's exegesis. You know, it's like he's cracking that wide open and getting in there and being honest with himself about it. You know, I mean, that's one
Yeah.
thing you got to love about him. He even questions himself. You know, I got this great idea, well, what if that's wrong, and how do I do this? And he tries to look
Yeah.
from every angle, and we're still limited. But people don't like when these things are broken. You know, it makes people uncomfortable. Cut up writing still makes people uncomfortable. And the interesting thing about cut up writing, you know, you mentioned like talking in each other's voices accidentally. Where's this come from? One of the times that happened when I was like, wait a minute, am I in Anastasia's world right now? What's going on here? This is like, it feels like the activator's world. Um, and what I had done was, and I'll do this sometimes, is I'd taken some material, you know, I'll usually use like food reviews, camera manuals, pornography, stuff that don't belong together, and I'll chop it up and stick that together.
And
And I'll
this is
do it,
what you mean by cut up, just to give a context for those who don't
yeah,
know.
for cut up writing. You know, it's basically collage for words. Um, and I'll do that for a few paragraphs, and it'll suggest an environment, it'll suggest a character, and then I throw that away and I work with those. Um, when I found myself writing, and I'm like, God, this feels a lot like the activators world. That's how I had begun. So it's not even coming out of my mind. It's coming from mixing up reality. Um, and you know, one of the things Burroughs said, Burroughs and Geison's the guy that came up with the cut up technique, is life is a cut up. Life works more like this than, you know, life isn't some linear 3 act structure novel. You know, that's got nothing to do with life. Nothing. Um, life is all kinds of crap getting thrown at you and what you filtered out and what you let
Mm,
in, you know. That
yeah.
that's what our definition of reality is expressing, you know. Maybe not your and I's definition, but you know, that's how we tend to think of reality. And so you start stirring that pot and people get really uncomfortable because it's not your safe little comfort zone. You know, some of Garbage In Gospel Out is literally camera manuals spliced with pornography and food reviews. Now that is not what comes out the other end of it. um, when you read that book, you won't pick up on any of that stuff because it's not related. Um, but it's all ideas being jumbled together, which is all thought really is, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's what are
Yeah.
we going to roll with, and what are we filtering out? And we're each doing that a little bit differently based off of sensory experience. And I mean, we know for a fact the senses are fallible.
Yeah.
So, you know, what
Yeah.
happens
So
when
like,
let's stir that pot and find out what's on the other end, you know? That the mind
and I
will
feel like this
superimpose a narrative, whether it's there or not, you know?
1000%, because that's how we're Pavloved by going to this like organized, structure of education first. Like, I feel like church was historically an organizing principle. Now it's this mass education as an organizing principle where we start to learn unconsciously and also consciously that we give our agency to someone else. And then we come full circle to, the publishing industry where the publishing industry is the gatekeeper. This idea is better than that one, so this one's getting published or it's getting promoted, and you get to see it more. It's got more exposure. Or you come to micro communities like this where you can actually allow things to happen. And like I don't know, I think you're similar to me though, and it's like, all right, well, it really doesn't matter, the number of units or whatever I'm selling. Like the most important thing to me is that this is out. And I can definitely say from my auto fiction, I will randomly get, messages from people like, hey, I didn't know that someone else struggled with sort of thinking, like, or you're writing my mind, you're writing the way I think, thank you. And I used to feel like shit, and now I feel a little better about myself because I'm not alone. I'm like, that's what I need. So for me, it was the impulse to really see myself. I think this goes back years. Like, I don't think I could have gotten anywhere in my writing career or just anywhere with my writing in general had I not written initially. First, it was 713, the autofiction that I did in 2002, and then meta work. But I had to see my own reality on paper, non sequitur, disorganized, like filled with lots of conscious blocks where I didn't realize because I had a lot of shit I didn't deal with. And for me, that at the time, that was like my reality. The way I perceived things was spotty or Swiss cheesy, I think I used to call it, right? And so now I've done a lot of work, and my what I write is different, but just to give that permission to myself and then ultimately to other people to, you know, to write what you see and write who you are. And I think that also starts to take the edge off of this like hyper focus on wellness and wholeness. Like, look, I tell people like in this psychospiritual support and guidance that I offer, we're moving towards wholeness. But that doesn't mean like you get to be this robot person. You get up, you have your picket fence, you go to work every day. You like being able to work every day is not a measure of health. Well, it is a measure of health, but it's not a measure of your value as a person. Like being able to get back to the good old narrative to get better or to get whatever and be part of like the mainstream thing and have what everybody else has is not a measure of your value as a person. What is your ability to express yourself and to be then that node that inspires someone or sees someone else or validates someone and allows them to move along on their journey. And I wanted to ask you your thoughts. We can still get to it. I wanted to ask you your thoughts about the trends in what has been written in sci-fi. But I was thinking before, when I was walking my dog, when I was walking Coco this morning, just how much I love the heck out of like Anne Leckie and CJ Cherry. CJ Cherry is so underexposed, in my opinion, both female sci-fi writers. Anne Leckie's stories or the ancillary justice stories about, this uh, part of a ship ultimately, this consciousness that ejects from being part of a ship, part that decides to not be part of like this group thing and become more human is really interesting. And then CJ Cherry is all about like the sublimation, man. Like it's not even necessarily power trips to me. It's like what culture gets to survive the next complete annihilation by another culture, and like what is the Sun trilogy? The Sun Wars? I don't, there's a story where like ultimately this fella who was like killing some culture because they were uncouth, tribal, had no value, right? He joins it and he's just like, no, this is what I choose now, and I feel like it's so powerful to not just read that story and hear that voice, but also kind of work our collective shadow out. That's where I'm going with this, right? We're talking about sharing thoughts and like this minefield and this like net of language and malleable reality and shaping reality. Ultimately, where we're going is like the collective unconscious and like what's out there and what comes in waves. Like for me, the sci-fi of like the 1950s and 1960s was all about, the UFOs and like the invasion from the north. And well, if you look historically, we were in America under the threat of being bombed by Russia, or so they told us, right? So everybody starts to write about looking to the sky, also writing from this very clinical perspective. And I know, at least in the history of parapsychology, the mid century parapsychologists were gravitating towards that lab. So we started to emerge from the dark Victorian seances and like table tipping and like the early 1900s, where it wasn't as clinical, where it was still being weaned out from superstition, all this weird shit, supernatural phenomena, and then like 1980s sci-fi and let me know what you think about it's all about like that fucking space opera, man. Star Wars, Star Trek, world domination and galaxy worlds, like domination. And so I feel like now with sci-fi and speculative fiction and like all of these like branching out into like the weird, quote unquote, weird forms or just different storytelling forms and worlds, I feel like it really is an inward gaze that's happening now that people are writing out because like man, like in the 90s and aughts, like it's all about the superpowers and like evolving stuff out of yourself, and now it's all about tripping through different realities and like different forms and structures of realities. And I mean, like, I also think it's no big coincidence that like plant medicine is like exploding, right? The use of plant medicine is exploding, telling us we actually are connected to like something else. And like, cool, talk with your elves when you're on DMT, and like, awesome, you want to come back and like, like tell me the mushrooms have this like ulterior motive because they're communicating on their network, and they're like, cool. And I think that a lot of what people, if they're not reading and writing it as sci-fi, I think there's that impulse to do the weird shit, but it also goes back to that permission, which also goes back to like having people like you and communities like yours. Pausing, going off my soapbox, passing the mic.
So, as far as science fiction is concerned, I think there's been historical patterns and then there's what's going on now, right? Like you mentioned a couple things from the past. When you look at science fiction from the United States, and I'm gonna simplify this a little bit just for the
Right,
sake of the
thank you.
conversation. But when you look at science fiction from the United States, whether that's the books or the films, there are two really common themes: xenophobia and imperialism. I mean, I don't have to explain why the United States is concerned with these things. You read Soviet science fiction or watch Soviet science fiction films, the main concern is difficulty in communication. Think
Mm,
think about those
thank
different
you.
places it's coming from. Now that the Cold War is apparently over, I'm not so sure about that it's over, but now that the Cold War is over, since the wall fell, um, as a species, I think we're trying to figure out how to do this global thing. We're blowing it, we haven't even figured out how to get along with our neighbors, let alone the whole world. But I think that's becoming more and more of a theme. How are we going to work this out together? And I don't mean the Reagan outside threat. That's the American xenophobia that I was talking about, that was so classically found in science fiction. Um, I think now it's how are we going to figure this out? So in a way, those things that you found in Soviet science fiction, those things you found in American science fiction are like smashing together now. Our films are still all about xenophobia and imperialism. I don't know if the movie industry wants to get over that anytime soon. But when you talk about the modern writing, I mean, like friendship is a common theme in a lot of modern books, instead of adversary. um
Mhm.
that's worth talking about. I mean, one thing I've said this to death, and I will say it over and over again, is if we can't envision a positive future, we can't create one. We have to visualize this thing first. We can use our media and our culture to do that. Books is a great way to test something out. um so what themes we gonna take on to do that? That's why solar punk and hope punk are coming up and stuff. And you know is there anything innovative in there yet? I don't know. Time will tell. Time will answer these questions for us. But like, science fiction is the playground for this sort of thing, right? um if we can get past, in this country, get past that xenophobia and imperialism, it'll do wonders for us. These are bad, um outdated things. What are we so afraid of? um you know yeah, news scary, whatever, get over it, dive in. There's going to be more new on the other end of that too. um
Right,
you know
right.
and
Or
and
write an alternate solution or an alternate reality where it's not so scary.
let's try one out. Nothing can be lost, it's just words on
Yeah.
paper, right? But it could change everything. you know um
Yeah.
but backing up to the publishing things you were saying about publishing, One of the things I did with the bookstore, and this was by design from the beginning, was I knew we would move into publishing quickly, and we did. And that's sort of my main focus. But the bookstore pays for the publishing house. So I can make decisions based off of what I think is wonderful art versus off of what I think is going to sell, and those
Right.
are two different things. The big publishing world can't do that. It's a money machine. It's there for profit. That's what they do. You can't take as many risks and choices when you're running things that way. um, it'd be great if the publishing house, Space Cowboy Publishing House, becomes lucrative. But first and foremost, it's about making great art, putting great art out there that might not otherwise have a chance, because it's not going to sell 5,000, 20,000 copies or whatever. But hey, if a couple hundred people, 1,000 people read this and dig it, that's cool. And I mean, there's 8 billion of us on this planet or whatever right now. You can find your 1,000, and you can make an okay living, and you can do what you want without compromising there. Um, and that's what it's all about. That success equals freedom thing for me. I'm not compromising unless there's a good reason to. And I don't mean to be,
Yeah.
I don't mean bullheadedness. I mean, hey, I got a vision and I'm going to see that through.
Yeah, exactly. With Planet Dust, it's the consulting, and right now that pays for the publishing, right? And eventually I'll be offering different things like courses and whatnot. But essentially it's so that I can continue to publish what I'm calling transformative nonfiction. And sure, there's my auto fiction, but then I also have nonfiction work that explains this point of view and is also rooted in having studied and just sort of like done the work through more traditional channels. So I'm not just like offering this like reality bending sort of therapeutic approach where I'm like, no, I'm working with a transpersonal version of the artist's way. Pull up, I got receipts, is what I'm saying. And so I don't compromise on what I want to produce. And up until now, it's been my own work, but I have a few works actually that I'm looking at next year that I'm like, I think this should be out there. I have there is a German woman who currently lives in Austria, and she wrote about she's an astrologer, and she wrote about the archetype Diana, and this, in astro speak, is rewilding your mind. And she wrote this book, which I happen to help her out with. So I know it's really good, but there is information about the myth of Diana, and then there's also like pieces of channeled text, and then there's also art. And I'm like, I love it because not only is there authority, she cites her references, we can trace back this information. There is historical information. There's also some weird shit. She's, switches perspective and now suddenly channeling this archetype. And for me, that goes in alignment with my other work, my research about creating this interface, this way to be in the ecosystem of a sentient universe. So like, yeah, like literally the trees are talking, like literally you can communicate with entities off planet. In my world, anything goes. In my sci-fi inspired worldview, anything goes. And that's what I bring to my client work. And I'm like, we need to see more books like this where it's mixed up and it's not just thrown away as fiction because she's saying she's channeling the archetype or she's saying she's channeling whatever the planet. I mean, there's plenty of astrology books like that. And I think in small astrology circles, maybe you realize that this says it's a channeled work and maybe you understand what that means. But if you don't, cool. And you read it just at face value, cool. Except if you do understand what channeling is, you realize you're just like, plugging in to the speaker of the universe and letting shit flow through you, which to me is no different than what you did with garbage in, gospel out, which, we all take our own form, but in that stream of consciousness, this is what I feel like it is. Oh, I'm going to call it an archetype. I'm going to name it this, like, okay, cool. But I think it's really powerful to show that these types of works are out there. And in this case, the person was seeking conventional publishing. And I think to them, that was a measure of integrity, of success. And then after a while, they came back to me and they were just like, I don't know how to get it out. I don't know what else to do. And I'm like, I'll do it because I see what you're doing here. And I think this is important. And this might mean you detaching from that whole like, oh, I'm a best-selling author and like body yada yada. Cause like, look, everybody's a fucking author. Like, there are millions of books produced every year. Okay. What does this book mean for you? For you, it's about putting out your reality and also offering the tools with which you use to work and engage your reality. And it's really, and especially in these like transpersonal arts, so whether it's astrology, tarot, divination, all these times you're calling in all your spells and calling in all these different realities, like you're doing the work of science fiction. So why not bring that into a reality and like I'll stand behind it. Like this is nonfiction then. I ain't making this up. I'm just pulling it in from this different perspective, this different worldview of a pansentient universe.
One thing I think when it comes to publishing, that a lot of people get wrapped up in is, I'm going to reach a lot of people, sell a million copies, I'm going to reach a million people. I think it's easy to forget that we reach people one at a time. You make friends one at a time. It
Thank
takes
you.
time to develop. You make fans one at a time. It's not like, you're going to go play some arena show your first time. That's not how things work. You connect with people one at a time. And back to the channeling thing you mentioned. Any writer that's been in the zone with their writing, because we get in the zone just like athletes where time doesn't matter anymore. Love this
Right.
place. It's
That
my
flow
favorite place
state,
to be.
right.
You're in that zone, that flow state. Every writer that's entered that will tell you they're taking dictation. The characters
Right.
have taken over. I don't choose
Yeah.
what this
Thank you for
person
that.
does
Yeah.
anymore. The character does it. And anytime, every writer I've heard talk about being in that flow, um, that's what's going on. Whether that's channeling or not, I'll let you speak to that. But like, it's you're taking dictation at that point. Where does it come from? I don't know. Is it my subconscious? Is it being from another planet? I couldn't tell you. I'm just here to take the dictation. And that zone, that flow state, is it's an important learning place because time is irrelevant there.
Right.
And that's again one of those things that makes you sort of distrust consensus reality. I remember this moment. It's maybe one of the first moment I experienced the zone when I was a kid. We're waiting for the bus in this parking lot that they don't like us hanging out in, right? They want us over by the bus stop, but we want to play handball because there's a nice wall there, right? We know we're not supposed to be there, whatever, we don't care. And some kids are playing ball and the ball bounces and it hits the wall. And I swear, time just like froze and everyone went in a circle. And like it didn't even take any time. I don't remember anyone moving. All of a sudden, everyone's in a circle. And I'm watching this ball bounce off the wall in super slow motion. It hits the fluorescent light, and that just falls down like slower than a feather would fall. And this is when everyone's in the circle looking, no, we're all in trouble. And then it hits the ground and explodes. This whole thing feels like it took like 5 minutes. Um, and then everybody runs and it's over. And that was the first time I experienced the zone where the flow of time didn't mean anything anymore. And you know me,
Cool.
I'm obsessed with time travel. You know all about my time stuff. But like, you have these experiences where you can dream years, and when they measure your rapid eye movement, it's like 45 seconds. So the brain is capable of organizing time in all these different ways. um I'm not going to trust this linear flow. We were talking before the show about time zones and how wacky it is. Like time is a construct.
Yeah.
It's one we don't agree on. It's one that's malleable. Ask any athlete, they'll tell you about this. But writers do it too. And like, I love flexing my time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And speaking of time, I'm just gonna be mindful of time because it's we've been talking for like an hour and like 20 minutes, bro. Like, where did the time go? Boom. That was cheesy. That was like an easy, like um an easy out, easy, or I'm gonna shut up. I want to thank you so much for your time here today. I'm gonna drop some links in the bio. This will go up on the conversation as a blog post. And so people can reach out to you, visit your delightful shop out in Joshua Tree. And if not, just like check out Simultaneous Times. There's books. We got volume 3 here. These are stories from the podcast in a book form. I love this. Like I love these little, I mean, I guess you would call them zines. They're just poetry. Like I love these that you've created. So just all in the art of expression, but really like distrust of reality. So like just putting your reality out there. For me, that's in some, that's what publishing is for you. And for me too, in a way. So wanted to thank you so much for your time. Thank you for this conversation. And I look forward to the next one.
Thank you,
Bumpy
Anastasia.
notes, homie.
There'll be many more, I'm sure.
I'm sure. I hope so. So much love to you, JP.